Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to objectively unpack a really comprehensive fact-check report that analyzes a fascinating and honestly highly debated shift in modern political rhetoric. Specifically, the source material we're looking at tracks the recent convergence of far-right and far-left anti-Zionist narratives. You know, the kind of talking points popularized by political commentators like Tucker Carlson. We'll be diving into exactly how researchers and historians are deconstructing these claims using hard data, international law, and documented history. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll cover 1. The horseshoe rhetoric shift, 2. Fact-checking historical revisionism, 3. Middle East Christian demographics, 4. International law and genocide, 5. Deconstructing anti-Semitic conspiracy tropes, and finally, 6. Tactics of disinformation. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. The horseshoe rhetoric shift, where extremes meet.
So, the report grounds its entire analysis in a concept known as the horseshoe convergence. It's basically the idea that the political spectrum isn't a straight line, but actually a horseshoe, where the extreme right and the extreme left bend toward each other and eventually meet. The source argues that these supposedly opposite political fringes have essentially merged their talking points when it comes to delegitimizing the state of Israel. And you can really see how this plays out. The source tracks how both of these extremes utilize the exact same vocabulary of foreign control and illegitimacy. You've got far-right isolationism leaning heavily on tropes of shadowy elites and financial grievances, and that converges perfectly with far-left narratives of anti-Western imperialism. The report notes that this shift completely derails the conversation. We're moving away from standard, legitimate policy critique and straight into the realm of structural demonization. Moving on to Section 2, Fact-checking historical revisionism, DNA, lineage, and World War II. The report highlights this specific claim right here, which is often used to frame modern Israelis as essentially European colonizers, totally erasing any indigenous ties. Now, the source identifies this as a direct revival of what historians call the Khazar hypothesis. That's a debunked pseudo-historical theory claiming European Jews are entirely descended from Central Asian converts rather than ancient Israelites. To dismantle that trope, the source relies on empirical data. Modern, peer-reviewed genetic studies consistently confirm that Jewish populations worldwide actually share a common Near Eastern genetic signature that links them directly back to the Levant. Plus, the report points out that denying a group's indigeneity based on centuries of forced Roman exile is historically inconsistent anyway. Furthermore, the report addresses the personal attacks on leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu by pointing to verifiable, documented deep local roots. So it refutes the whole narrative of historic erasure with objective biographical facts. The source also tackles some incredibly severe claims regarding World War II. Recently, commentators have platformed theories suggesting the Holocaust was merely an accidental logistical error caused by supply strains on the Eastern Front, and that Winston Churchill was actually the true villain of the war. To refute this, the text lays out a clear timeline. It proves that the systematic, ideological intent of the final solution was entirely premeditated. Mobile killing squads were systematically executing civilians long before any of those logistical supply issues existed. The report firmly identifies these narratives not as alternative history, but as a literal revival of 1930s Nazi propaganda. Section 3. Middle East Christian demographics, status, citizenship, and statistics. The report anchors its demographic fact-check with this pretty striking number. It points out that contrary to narratives claiming Israel is somehow purging Christians, Israel is actually the only Middle Eastern country where the indigenous Christian population has steadily grown since 1948, reaching over 185,000 today. A really frequent talking point analyzed in the report is the claim that Christians fare better in nations like Qatar simply because the raw population number is higher there. But by analyzing the comparative legal reality side by side, the text exposes what it calls an equivocation fallacy. It points out the massive flaw in equating disenfranchised migrant workers in Qatar who face strict religious bans and have zero path to citizenship with the fully enfranchised Christian citizens living in Israel who have voting rights and actually serve in the government. It's just an entirely different reality on the ground.
Okay, Section 4. International law and genocide, definitions and the ICJ.
The report anchors its analysis of this highly charged term in a definitive legal criterion, dolus specialis, or specific intent. So the absolute crucial point here is that under the 1948 UN Genocide Convention, the tragedy of mass civilian casualties in urban warfare doesn't, on its own, legally constitute genocide. The law requires definitive proof of a specific premeditated intent to destroy a group.
Which brings us to how the source actually evaluates that intent. According to independent military analysts cited in the report, Israel's documented operational tactics, like issuing evacuation warnings and creating humanitarian corridors, are fundamentally incompatible with genocidal intent, which normally seeks to maximize civilian death. The source contrasts this directly with groups like Hamas, whose foundational documents and their use of the river to the sea slogan explicitly call for the destruction of the Israeli state.
Furthermore, the explainer clarifies the ongoing International Court of Justice process step by step. It emphasizes that the ICJ has not issued a finding of guilt against Israel. That initial ruling of plausibility everyone talked about, the report notes that was merely a low procedural threshold just to let the case proceed to step 2, the written pleadings. The major takeaway here is that using the term genocide as a settled legal fact in current public discourse is factually incorrect, because a final verdict from the court is literally still years away.
Section 5. Deconstructing Anti-Semitic Conspiracy Tropes. The Gateway to Disinformation.
The source identifies a fascinating but honestly highly concerning rhetorical tactic that it calls weaponized incredulity. It's essentially the act of just asking questions. The report argues that by framing extreme conspiratorial premises as simple, innocent inquiries, commentators can completely bypass the burden of providing evidence, all while successfully mainstreaming dangerous disinformation directly to their audiences. The text painstakingly debunks these fabrications one by one. For instance, claiming an American domestic lobbying group like unpack is a foreign agent, or throwing out baseless links between Jeffrey Epstein and Israeli intelligence. The report even debunks a fabricated claim by Tucker Carlson where he said he was targeted by Israeli security at an airport. Official records proved it was literally just standard VIP passport control. The source demonstrates how these claims rely heavily on historic anti-Semitic libels of shadowy control and dual loyalty rather than, objective journalism or factual evidence.
Finally, Section 6. Tactics of Disinformation, Moral Inversion and Truth Decay. The report outlines this concept of moral inversion by portraying a state defending itself against documented adversaries as the sole aggressor. Reality gets completely turned upside down. The crucial point the source makes here is that techniques like moral inversion aren't just normal run-of-the-mill political bias. The report argues they actively manufacture hatred by stripping a targeted group of its humanity, which drastically lowers the barrier for public acceptance of discrimination.
So, we're going to leave you with this final provocative thought drawn directly from the source's analysis. If the bedrock of historical fact, peer-reviewed science, and international legal definitions can be so easily inverted using the tactics we've explored today, what does that actually mean for the future of our geopolitical discourse? When truth decays into weaponized incredulity, how do global democratic alliances even survive? It's a huge question, and one that absolutely demands our attention. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.